Yes.
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 Finally.
Yes. Yes.
Good,
We
finally.
can hear you. Yeah.
My wife, Valeria, is my technician. She fixed it.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, we can see you. Thank you.
Should thank Valeria.
Yeah, thank her.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Chomsky. I think we are ready to begin this meeting.
Okay.
Yes. Let me. Okay. Good morning, everybody, and good morning, good evening to our esteemed guests, Professor Chomsky, Professor Krashen, and others. Thank you to each and every one of you for being with us today. As the coordinator of the Language Teaching Research Group, I would like to extend our warmest welcome to Professor Chomsky, who has honored us today. Professor Chomsky, thank you for taking time off your busy schedule to be with us today. It's also a great pleasure to welcome yet other distinguished professors in this group, Professor Krashen, Professor Mason, and others. I would like to leave the floor to Dr. Zandi, the head of language teaching group at the Institute of Advanced Studies in Basic Sciences. Afterwards, we're going to have Professor Chomsky's presentation on the status quo of language studies. This will be followed by a question and answer part. Thank you very much. Dr. Zandi, would you please?
Hello, everyone. I would like to welcome all of you to the weekly seminars of the Language Teaching Group at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Basic Sciences, or IASBS. I would like to thank Professor Chomsky and Professor Krashen and all the other distinguished guests for joining us today. And it's really an honor to have you here. So I leave the floor to Professor Chomsky. Please, sir.
Okay. Can you hear me, first of all?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes.
You sent me. Okay. You sent me a list of very interesting questions. I thought about them, possible answers to them. I can just talk about the subject you raised, or we could move right to the questions and I could present my feelings about them. Actually, I could almost read them off. So whichever you like, I can talk.
I think we would like to hear some introductory remarks about the status quo of language studies in general, and your latest theories, and then, of course, we can go on to the questions.
Well, I'll start by talking about what I think is essentially the origin of modern linguistic studies. Not very well known, but I think we should learn about it and understand it. It begins at the beginning of the scientific revolution of the 17th century. Of course, there had been actually millennia of study of language before this, with many important contributions. Greek grammarians, Roman grammarians, Arab grammarians had made many contributions. But something new happened in the 17th century, quite generally, and it didn't ignore language. That was included. What happened was that Galileo and his contemporaries agreed to be puzzled by phenomena of nature. The neo-scholastic consensus at the time was that they pretty much had answers to things. So if you're holding a cup of water and you let go, the cup falls to the ground. A steam, let's say, the cup falls to the ground, the steam rises up. So why is that? Well, each one is going to its natural place. If you have a big ball of lead and a small ball of lead, and you drop them, the big ball will fall faster because it has greater mass. If you look at an object, you see it as a triangle, say, because the form of the object flits through the air and gets into your brain as a triangle. Galileo and his contemporaries were not satisfied that they didn't see those as true explanations, and they began to seek authentic explanations. As they did so, they found that most of our intuitions are wrong. Things don't happen the way they think they do. The two balls fall at the same rate. Many other things are different, and you go on from there to develop modern science. Well, one of the topics that they were concerned with, in fact, was language. They wondered at what seemed to them and should seem to us as an astonishing fact. With a few dozen sounds, we can formulate an infinite number of expressions, each of which captures a thought in our minds, and we can find a way to, and we can use these sounds to externalize the internal thought so that we can convey them to others who can grasp the inner workings of our minds simply through this magical process. How can that take place? Galileo regarded the alphabet as maybe the greatest discovery in human history because it was able to capture this miracle. Well, from that began a process of development of what was called rational and universal grammar, rational and general grammar. The main work was Poor Royal grammar in 1660, went on from there for a couple of centuries. It was rational because it was trying to give explanations, not mere descriptions. It was general because they were interested in the universal properties that they assumed language shared. And they took for granted what we now have good evidence for, that this astonishing capacity is a real species property of humans, common to all humans, and unique to humans. There are no analogs in the animal world. All of that seems to be true. This tradition proceeded into through the late 19th, early 20th century. Maybe the last representative was the great Danish linguist Otto Jespersen. After that, it was swept aside by structuralist, behaviorist currents, which took a very different view of language. They regarded language as either a social contract, a set of habits to act in particular situations. Edward Sapir, Leonard Bloomfield, among the philosophers, W.V. Quine and others, language was a set of sentences associated to stimuli by conditioned response. These were the days of behaviorism. But the tradition collapsed. It was revived again. One of the reasons the traditions collapsed is that there was no real understanding of how a finite object like the brain could have infinite capacity. To use Wilhelm von Humboldt's phrase, how could you make infinite use of finite means? That problem was solved in the mid-20th century by the work of great mathematicians, Kurt Gödel, Alan Turing, and others, who established the modern theory of computability, which does give the insight into how this can happen, how a finite object, your laptop computer, your brain, can have infinite capacity. That made it possible to begin to study the traditional problems, which incidentally had all been forgotten. Nobody knew anything about this at the time. It was rediscovered decades later. But how these traditional problems could be addressed. It meant taking language to be not something external to the mind, like a social contract or a set of habits, but rather something internal to the mind, something internal to my mind and yours, very much the way Galileo and his contemporaries had understood it. And this internal computational device satisfies what is sometimes called the basic property of language. Namely, it generates an infinite set of structured expressions, each of which is the linguistic characterization of a thought in the mind, and has mechanisms to specific mechanisms to construct and develop these, and on the side, ways of externalizing it into one or another sensory motor medium. It's typically sound, but it can just as well be vision. Sign language is virtually identical with spoken language in its fundamental structure, its acquisition, its even its neural representation. You can even use touch. It's not as good, but can be done. So it's basically the sensory modalities independent of the language. When you have this system all together, it does approach the Galilean challenge. Doesn't completely meet it, because as Descartes extended the Galilean challenge, he focused on the inherent creative aspect of the use of language. We are constantly using new expressions, new to us, new to our interlocutors, maybe new in the history of the language, instantly intelligible. No one recognizes that they're new. It's impossible. And we do this in a way which is appropriate to the situations we're in, but is not caused by them. Critical difference. Somehow we have a creative capacity which we use all the time without even thinking about it. If you think about it, you see two people talking. Each of them is producing new expressions, unbounded length. The other understands them perfectly. If you took those same sentences that are created and you randomized the words, it would be complete gibberish. So how can this be? What is it in the minds of the two individuals that enables this to happen, that enables you to capture the basic property? Well, that's the origin of generative grammar that goes on through the decades. By now, it's reached a point, I think, where new vistas are opening up, entirely new in the history of language. The mechanisms that have been pursued for decades have successively been simplified, sharpened, deepened. We're now at the point where we can quite plausibly claim, can't prove, but can plausibly speculate that the simplest possible computational operation, it's called merge and current work, suffices to yield the basic property along with a lexicon, which is partly specific to particular languages, though fundamental properties in common. And there are some cases where quite deep properties of language can be shown to follow simply from this. Furthermore, this approach for the first time offers the possibility of giving an account of the evolution of language. There's been plenty of talk about that, many books about it, but they really don't amount to much, because the systems of language that they're trying to account for are far too complex to have evolved under the by now pretty well known conditions of evolution of language, which are very narrow. But now this can be approached. Now, from this point on, we go on to talk about how it works and what the results are and so on. But with this general outline, I'll stop and leave the matter to you for your questions.
Thank you very much for the introductory remarks. I think you already have the list of the questions, and if you please, answer them as you wish.
Well, let me see if I can find them. I have them somewhere.
We can ask the questions if you don't have them available right now. We can ask the questions.
Okay, why don't you do that?
So, okay, Ms. Khali, I would like to invite you to ask your questions. You have 2 questions, please.
Yeah, let me first thank Professor Chomsky for accepting our invitation. This has been so generous of you. And I am the one who sent you like lots of emails every day. I'm so sorry, but we all wanted this to happen. So you've been source of inspiration. You, Professor Krashen, you've been source of inspiration for all of us. So thank you. Actually, I had sent you, Professor Chomsky, I had sent you 2 questions of mine. But if I can change my questions to another question, which I thought more relevant, because I'm an English teacher, when I go to my classes, the first thing my students will ask me, of course, after coronavirus, is a gist of this talk we had here. Your universal grammar is understandable for us people of academia, people who are in the profession, but for ordinary people, because some people believe that science has to be simplified to the extent that ordinary people can understand. And I want to hear it in your own words. How do you simplify universal grammar so that my school students also understand what that means? Thank you.
Well, let's take another human faculty. Let's take the faculty of vision. Okay, we can all see. I can see you. When I look at you, I see a person. Actually, what's hitting my retina is not a person. My eyes are carrying out what's called saccadic motion, seeing different spots on the screen in front of me. But somehow, out of this sequence of random spots, which are not part of my consciousness, my mind is working away and it's presenting an image of a person. How does that happen? How are we able to do this? Well, there's only one possibility. It's nothing that we've learned. Okay, it turns out that experience is relevant to it. We know this from experiments with animals like cats. If you deprive a kitten of structured visual stimuli in the first weeks of its life, it goes blind. It has to have structured, patterned stimulation in the first weeks of its life, and that triggers an innate, genetically determined capacity, which then goes on to produce this amazing capacity. Language is pretty much the same. The name of the universal, each infant has internally a system, a genetically determined system, which is triggered by external stimuli. Here are some noises. Actually, it's a very tricky business, hearing noises, and even when you hear noises in a foreign language, it's just noise. You can't pick out the words, you can't pick out the sounds, you can hear something over and over, you don't even know it's the same thing. And that's the situation of the infant. But somehow it has the capacity to overcome this, instantly pick out particular configurations of sound, go on to construct in its mind the complex expressions that we then use. You know that 2 or 3-year-old infant already has mastered a huge amount of knowledge of language, far more than it can exhibit. And it goes on to the state in which we now are, reaching late childhood usually. How does this happen? Same way as vision. There's a genetically determined component. There's some external stimuli which have an effect on, which trigger its operation and affect the shape that it takes. That genetically determined component is what's called universal grammar. We could call universal vision the innate component that enables you to see a person instead of just a series of dots from saccadic eye motion. The universal grammar enables the Galilean challenge to be met. What so amazed Galileo and his contemporaries is as they pretty much guessed, an internal system of what they call general and rational grammar, what we nowadays call universal grammar, which suffices to provide the basic properties of any language. And it turns out it used to be thought back in the 1950s, in the days of structural linguistics, that languages can differ in almost any possible way, and each one has to be studied without any presuppositions. We now know that that's totally wrong. Turns out that all languages are very much cast to the same mold. The apparent differences between them, which makes it, are rather superficial. Most of them have to do with the way language is externalized into the sensory motor system. The core part, which yields the infinite array of thoughts, that's probably uniform or near uniform among humans, pretty much like capacity for vision. Now that's the basic point.
I really appreciate. Thank you so much, Professor Chomsky. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Chomsky. I have a question. My question is, are you currently working on any special theories? Are there any new theories that you are considering? And the second question is, have you had second thoughts about your path theories?
Well, if you look back over the history of the past 70 years, turns out it's very much like what happens in the standard sciences. If you're teaching physics, let's say, to graduate students, if you're still teaching what you taught 5 years ago, either your brain dead or the field is dead. In the sciences, there are constant changes, new discoveries, new insights, revisions of past theories, sometimes abandonment and replacement of new ones. Now, that happens in all the sciences that are alive. And it's happened in linguistics in the last 70 years. So if you go back to the beginning, the basic ideas have stayed pretty much the same. So the idea about what I call the basic property, the internal computational device that yields an infinite array of structured expressions that capture thoughts, that basic concept has remained unchanged. In the question of how it's implemented, that's changed. So in the early days, as some of you may know, it was assumed that the implementation is by two kinds of rules: phrase structure rules, transformational rules. By the 1960s, it was recognized that phrase structure rules can't possibly work. They're conceptual and factual problems with them. They were tossed out in favor of deeper theories. Over the years, the transformational rules, which were originally quite complex, have been repeatedly simplified. By the 1990s, a number of us, me included, began to think that enough had been learned about the complexities of language so that we might try to approach what is sometimes called the strong minimalist thesis, show that all of the basic properties of languages can be accounted for by a computational procedure which uses the simplest possible combinatorial operation, called merge in recent years, with invoking general computational principles of computational efficiency, minimal operations, and so on. We can think of these as basically natural laws, which are invoked in every area where there's computation, including language. Well, the new theories, the ones I've been working on for some years, proceed to develop these ideas. And I think it's opening quite new vistas. This is the first time in the millennial long history of linguistics that it's possible actually to demonstrate that fundamental properties of language, which were never even noticed in the past, simply follow directly from the simplest computational operations, along with general principles of computational efficiency. Many complex and properties of languages have been falling within this framework. It's a long way from proving that everything does, but it's quite astonishing progress, I think, and quite a new picture of how the mind works, how language works, how the core of human creativity and thinking works. So that's a response to both aspects of your question. The early mechanisms repeatedly have been improved, changed, overthrown, modified. The basic core principles, core ideas, which actually have a Galilean origin, those have been sharpened, improved, but fundamentally remain intact. And I think we're now on the verge of having, for the first time, genuine explanations of linguistic phenomena, genuine in the sense that they meet the fundamental condition of evolvability. They could have evolved under the conditions that we know are the conditions of evolution of language, the general conditions.
Thank you very much. I have one more question. My question is, my question is, you have had a very full academic life. What is your advice for young and novice researchers? And how can we become a very good researcher such as yourself?
Well, I think the most important thing, apart from having the motivation and the desire, is to allow yourself to be puzzled. Accept the stance of scientists like Galileo and others who created the scientific revolution. As I said, the most difficult step that they took was to take what seems obvious, like the cup falls and the steam rises, and to say, wait a minute, that's not obvious at all. Why does it happen? Why doesn't something else happen? As soon as you take that step, you're into the sciences. If you're interested in language, take the first step that Galileo and his contemporaries took. Think of that amazing fact that I described earlier. Or, for example, the simple fact that when two people are conversing, they are constantly producing new expressions appropriate to the situation, not caused by it. They could have said other things. And the other person understands them. Whereas if you simply took the words of the sentences and randomized them, it would be as if they're talking another language, just total gibberish. But you should be puzzled by that. It's extremely puzzling. We don't really understand it. We only understand rudiments of it. But once you're willing to be puzzled by that, then it's off and running. You start looking into it, You find other puzzles, and some of them are very strange. So let me just mention one, which nobody even noticed until 30 or 40 years ago, though it's a ubiquitous property of language and a very strange one. It's the property called structure dependence. So take a simple sentence like this. The man who fixed the car carefully packed his tools. Okay. Notice that the sentence is ambiguous. It could mean he fixed the car carefully or he carefully packed his tools. Okay. The man who fixed the car carefully picked his tools. Either interpretation. Now put carefully in front of the sentence. Carefully, the man who fixed the car packed his tools. It's unambiguous, which is surprising to begin with, but the nature of the interpretation is even more surprising. The word carefully is an adverb is going to be associated with a verb, but it doesn't get associated with the closest verb. It gets associated with the most remote verb. Carefully, the man who fixed the car packed his tools. It's not carefully fixed, it's carefully packed. Now, if you think about it, that's very surprising. The simplest computational operation would take the sentence, see the word carefully, look for the first verb that you find, associate carefully with it. But we don't do that. We look for the more remote one. Furthermore, infants do this at about 30 months old, less than 3 years old. They all do this. And furthermore, it is uniform for all constructions in all languages. And it's very strange because it means the infant is disregarding 100% of what it hears, namely linear order, and paying attention only to something it never hears. What it's paying attention to is structural proximity. So if you take that sentence and you put brackets around the phrases, so the man who fixed the car is one phrase, then comes packed his tools. Packed is closer to carefully structurally than fixed is. Fixed is deeply embedded inside the structure, fixed is not. So what the infant is doing is ignoring 100% of what it hears and paying attention to something it never hears. Structure, can't hear that, it's not in the sentence. And that is done for all constructions in all languages, obviously without instruction. Nobody is instructed without learning. You have no evidence for it. It's just part of our nature. Well, very puzzling. How can that be? That now you're into real contemporary linguistics. Only in recent years have we discovered, recognized that this follows automatically from using the simplest computational procedure. I can't show it to you without a blackboard in a few minutes, but it's pretty straightforward. Okay, it's at this point that you're finding real results, not just organizing phenomena, which is quite interesting and important, but going to a new stage and giving deep explanations for them. Furthermore, this explanation satisfies the conditions of evolution of language. It's based on the simplest computational procedure, the one that nature would have picked as soon as the capacity to compute without bounds arose in the human species. We know it did arise because it's there, it's not anywhere else. And this says if you pick the simplest way of doing it, the way that nature would of course picked, you get results like this. As you proceed in this way, you really are entering new territory. Now, going back to your question, what's your advice to young linguists? Be puzzled. Be puzzled by what looks obvious. All of this seems entirely obvious, so much so that nobody even thought about it in the thousands of years of study of language. But if you ask yourself why this is the case, then you're, as I said, off and running. And the more you look into it, the more mysteries you find, the more puzzles you find, the more exciting the field is. Occasionally you get answers. Sometimes the answers just open up new questions. But I think that's the main advice that I think one should keep in mind.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. Mr. Mortazavi, you're up.
Yes,
I'm sorry,
Mr.
before Mr. Mortazavi, Professor Chomsky, maybe it's too late, but I should have asked for your permission for the recording. Is it okay that we record this meeting or should we turn it off now?
Sure, that's fine.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor Chomsky, for the insightful, perfect answers. I would like to ask Mr. Faraji to ask his question.
Good evening, dear Professor Chomsky.
Yeah.
Firstly, I want to thank you for your time and for your attendance. I really appreciate. My question is about implicit and explicit knowledge. As you in UG some years ago believed that there is no interface between implicit and explicit knowledge, I was wondering to know what is your viewpoint now about the relationship between implicit and explicit knowledge, especially after these many years, after these many studies, I mean, cognitive linguistics ones, I mean, neurolinguistics ones, and so on and so forth. So what is your...
I didn't, after what? The last
what?
part.
I said now, after, especially after these many years, after these many studies, and during these years, about with cognitive linguistics studies, I mean, neurolinguistic studies, and so on and so forth, many studies in this realm. What do you know, what do you believe now about the relationship, about the interface between implicit and explicit knowledge? I mean, there is no interface between them, weak interface position or a strong one.
Well, let's take the example I just gave. Okay, the man who fixed the car packed his tools. We have explicit knowledge. We know what that means. Okay, we know that it means he carefully packed his tools. That's explicit knowledge. If you ask anybody what the sentence means, they'll say that's what it means. But we also have implicit knowledge of how it happens. Why does it happen? That carefully is associated with the linearly remote verb and not with the linear proximate verb. That's implicit knowledge. If you ask somebody to explain that, they can't do it. It requires considerable insight into the way language is designed and formed, the way computational systems work. So but we know it. It's implicit knowledge. As I said, an infant of 30 months old, experiments have shown, already knows that. Of course, it's not explicit knowledge for the infant or even for an adult, but it's implicit knowledge. And in fact, it's like almost everything we do. Suppose we take a walk down the street. We know that if there's a stone in front of us, we should walk around it. We have no idea how we can get our legs to move in the proper manner so that we don't fall over. That's implicit knowledge, sometimes called tacit knowledge. Almost all of our knowledge is not accessible to consciousness. There's no possible way to introspect and find out what it is. It's internal to us, something going on within us. Same with the construction of sentences. I understood what you said, you understood what I said, and neither of us can introspect and figure out how that can happen and why, if the words were, say, randomized, it couldn't do it. You can't introspect into that sort of thing. It's implicit knowledge, kind of like the knowledge that enables you to walk across the street. Can't possibly think about it and figure out what is going on. In fact, notice that humans, big mammals generally, have two brains. One brain is the one that's in our head. The other brain is in our gut. It's a huge brain, tens of millions of neurons, very much similar to what's going on in our brains. It can have diseases, it can have psychiatric diseases, pretty much the same thing as what's going on in our brain. What it's doing is regulating the basic functions of the body. You can't introspect into what the gut brain is doing. It's impossible. You can study it from the outside, the way you study, quantum physics from the outside, but have no way of accessing the knowledge. And the surprise of many people, the same is true of our thinking. You can't introspect into it. Even what we call inner speech, like talking to yourself. You can't go a minute without talking to yourself. It takes a tremendous act of will to stop this inner discourse that's going on all the time. But it's not inner. It's external. It's the externalization of language when your articulatory organs aren't working, you decide to inactivate them. What's going on inside is very different. The structure of the sentences that yields their meanings is absolutely beyond the level of any introspection, just like the operations of the gut brain are, or walking across the street. So there is implicit knowledge and explicit knowledge, and of course, there's interaction between them. Some of implicit knowledge does surface as explicit knowledge, but very little of it, and mostly quite superficial.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, dear professor. So, if I'm not mistaken, you now mostly believe in continuum rather than a dichotomy, isn't it?
Sorry, but I didn't understand that. So could you say it again?
I said, which one do you prefer to use about the relationship between implicit and explicit? A continuum or a dichotomy?
Well, actually, not very much is known about that. When you're what we call talking to yourself, suppose you walk into a room and you see a friend of yours sitting there, and you think, oh, I'll go over and talk to him. But then you notice that he's talking to somebody else, and that other person who you know will be insulted if you say to the guy you were thinking of what you were planning to say. So you say, okay, I'll say something different. Then something else happens and you decide on something else. All of this happens in an instant, a single instant. You think you're talking to yourself, but you're not. If you really think about it, little bits of fragments are coming into your mind. A piece of a phrase, maybe the end of the sentence before you begin to start the sentence. And from all of this is happening so rapidly that it would be impossible to articulate it. Well, that's the interesting part of language and social interaction. The part that you actually see on the surface is very unrevealing. I mean, for our lives, that's what we deal with. But the internal part is where all the interest is. In fact, there's some very strange things known that have been known for some years, not very well understood. So there were experiments a couple dozen years ago which showed that if you're deciding to say, lift your finger, a couple of 100 milliseconds before you lift your finger, you're conscious of wanting to lift your finger. But about maybe 300 milliseconds before that, the physical motions are already in, the brain is already carrying out and planning the official, the actual motions which are going to take place. This is long before you become conscious of having made a decision. So all kinds of means the decision was actually made unconsciously, well before the plan to carry out the action even reached your consciousness. I mean, these are all, in a way, they shouldn't be too mysterious. It shouldn't be too mysterious that it's happening, because that's the way everything in the body works. Like you're totally unconscious of your gut brain, you're totally unconscious of how you walk across the street. You can't possibly become conscious of it. And the interesting recent understanding is that the same is true of your thinking and your speaking, almost entirely unconscious and beyond the level of consciousness. Little bits and pieces come out. We don't know why or how.
Thank you, dear professor.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Khaja,
Thank
Professor
you.
Chomsky, for the insightful comments. I think Professor Krashen has some comments to add. So, Professor Krashen, would you please?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Good. I want to comment on the relationship between implicit and explicit knowledge, of course. When I was a graduate student at UCLA, which was the center of Chomskyan research, we were taught the theory, and it was obvious to me and everyone else, I now know this was dead wrong, that all we had to do was learn all about the latest descriptions of grammar from MIT and apply them to the classroom. I remember when Paul Kaparsky's papers came out, and we were all charmed by his analysis, factives, etc. I remember going over to my colleagues, I was also teaching English as a second language, saying, we now know how to teach this structure. We simply give people the rule that Professor Kaparsky came up with and give them exercises where they can practice it, correct them, and everything will be fine. We have, the last 45 years of my life is showing the limits of explicit knowledge. It's simply not that way at all. We had the assumption that the language acquisition device turned off at puberty, which was the result of a really beautiful argument of Eric Lenneberg, which I now think is totally wrong, even though I have huge admiration for Lenneberg's work because he asked the right question. As Professor Chomsky has said many times, there's nothing wrong with being wrong. Lenneberg was wrong, but it really pushed us ahead. It was wonderful. He claimed that when you reach puberty, things happen in the brain. The left side goes to the left, the right side goes to the right, and acquisition, implicit learning cannot happen. Everything is explicit. My early research of my colleagues showed that was absolutely not true, that adults, children doing a second language, and young kids becoming literate went through a process that was totally implicit. It accounted for everything. I wonder these days whether that works with animal language, and someday we'll find out if this works for alien language. According to the merge hypothesis, probably not, but at least it asks the absolute right question. And I must tell you how disappointed I was, how disappointed my colleagues were, because of our admiration for the grammatical systems that Chomsky and his colleagues came up with. But it certainly pushed us forward. We now know that it's certainly an implicit system. The similarities are overwhelming. We know that language acquisition at all ages runs on the same engine, which is basically comprehension of what you hear, what you read. It results in a predictable order of acquisition, and it's extremely difficult to apply conscious knowledge to language. It's nearly impossible. It takes all kinds of mental gymnastics, and it doesn't last very long. It's a very fragile system. So thank you for pushing us forward, asking the question, and I'm quite happy with the answer, and I think it's reduced a lot of suffering for people all over the world. That's my statement.
Okay, Professor Chomsky, do you have any comments on Professor Krashen's comment?
I think that's quite right. Say take Eric Linneberg, he was an old friend of mine. We were graduate students together, and as graduate students, we were part of a very small group, 3 or 4 people who didn't believe anything that was going on at heart. We were. That was the heyday of behaviorism. Quine, Skinner, others. It all seemed crazy to us. We were off in some corner. Eric went off he made some very amazing discoveries, some of which he never even published because they were so outlandish that it didn't seem possible. So, for example, he was very much interested in language growth under unusual conditions. So, language of the deaf, for example. And one of the things he did was visit the school, I think it was the Perkins School it was called, for the deaf in Boston, and observe what was happening. And those were the days of a very strict oralist tradition. Teachers were told, parents were told, you should never gesture to your deaf children because they have to learn how to lip read. So don't even hold your hands behind your back. Don't even do this. He went to the school. He noticed the teacher was strict oralist, but he noticed something strange. When the teacher turned to the blackboard, the kids started going like this to each other. And they had obviously created a sign language. It's just part of their internal nature. By now, some things are understood about that. But at that time, it sounded like saying the earth is flat. So he told a couple of his friends, but he never said anything about it. But his work was exactly as you said, asking all the right questions. His book 50 years ago,
Biological Foundation,
founded the biology of language. The contents of it are very much appropriate for today. It's a rich store of information and insights. Some of the answers probably wrong, but that's the nature of science. As you said, he asked the right questions, pursued them, pushed the subject very far forward. And that's the way developments have taken place. You have to look at today's best ideas as well as that's where we are today, but they're probably wrong. The next generation will show there's a better way. That's the way understanding develops. It's what makes the field lively and exciting. Otherwise, it would be a bore. No point in even teaching.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Mortazavi, do we have questions?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor Chomsky and Professor Krashen. There's Ms. Susana Llanes, I think Dr. Susana from Chile, if I'm right, I'm not sure. Dr. Llanes, right? Would you please? She might not be available now. Okay. I think Mr. Ibrahimi, would you please ask your question?
Of course. Once again, hello, Professor, and thank you for your time. This is an honor of 1,000 lifetime. I got this question. According to the basics of universal grammar and poverty of stimulus, I want to ask you how influential behaviorism was on developing universal grammar.
It was very influential in providing a foil. Go back to the actual origins. We were Harvard University, center of hardcore behaviorism, radical behaviorism, when there were actually 3 graduate students who became close friends. Eric Lenneberg, Morris Halley died recently, and me. We met at Harvard as grad students. We became close friends. We shared, at the time, the conception of language was basically B.F. Skinner's verbal behavior. Hadn't been published yet, but it was circulating manuscripts. W. Quine, who was very influential figure, very prominent, important philosopher. He bought this hook, line, and sinker. That's the basis of his philosophy of language, extraordinarily influential. The 3 of us thought that this whole picture was totally wrong. We began on our own reading literature which was under a ban, European ethology, people like Tinberg and Lorentz, comparative psychologists in the United States and Europe, like Thorpe and others, all of which were talking about the way in which instinct shapes what animals do, with very interesting results. That was not supposed to happen. Everything is supposed to be formed by operant conditioning. Well, that was behaviorism. It seemed to us totally crazy. So that was a stimulus to try to show what's wrong with it. And in fact, in our combined and partly separate ways, that's what we devoted our lives and work to. But that was the only influence.
Thank you so very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Chomsky and Mr. Ibrahimi. Ms. Yanis, Ms.
Yes, I'm right
Dr. Yes, Dr. Yanis, right? If I'm not mistaken.
No, not doctor, just the masters. It's a pleasure to
Okay.
meet Dr. Chomsky, Dr. and Krashen. This question is for both of you. I don't know if both of you can care to respond. I'm here in Chile, and in Spanish, we have hierarchy mentality with, for example, the distinction between the second person plural and singular. For example, we have the two votes distinction, the TV distinction. So we have a hierarchy mentality, and we know that language impacts society. Now, here in Chile, some populations have gone beyond and are trying to impose change in language to have a more inclusive terms of gender. In Spanish, we have the female and masculine genders, but the government has tried to change this into a more inclusive language. And unfortunately, the Real Academia de España, like the language officials or the language police of the Spanish language, have denied this and rejected this usage of language. If the society is trying to change and modify language, how long would it take for it to be official without the official acceptance of the Royal Academy?
Well, actually, languages are very resistant to official efforts to shape them in a particular direction. There's a long history of this in English. For a long time, English grammarians thought that English should be Latin. If it doesn't work like Latin, there's something wrong with it. So children in school are taught rigorously that they're supposed to say things like, he and I arrived, instead of what every kid will say, him and me arrived. They're supposed to say, and this, you're supposed to say, it is I, not it is me, because that's what you would say if you were talking Latin. This is driven into children in school. They can kind of repeat it, but if nobody's paying attention, they're going to go back and say, it's me, or him and me are here, because that's the way English works. The default form in English is accusative, not nominative. What happens is that it ends up with people making all sorts of mistakes. Like you constantly hear people saying, between you and I, because you're kind of taught that where I want to say me, I'm supposed to say I. But of course, if you go back to the Latinate grammarians, in that case, it should be me. But the language somehow resists these efforts to shape it into a foreign mold invented by pedantic grammarians, things that never had anything to do with the language. There's a whole history of this. And it may have some marginal effect on the way language is used, but it can't really affect the core of the system.
For example, in English, we have the term we, right? It's all inclusive. In Spanish, we don't. If the people keep using an inclusive language, my question is, how long does it usually take for it to be as like a universally accepted within the Royal Academy?
Well, it's beginning to get into the question of why do languages change altogether? Why don't they always stay the same? And there are many factors in that. A lot of it often has to do not with language literally changing, but with the spread of dialects shifting. So one dialect that could have been more marginal sometimes gets more extensive, like the Florence dialect in Italian, which came to be mainstream Italian. There are other factors like just teenage jargon. The teenagers also always innovate quite a lot, and sometimes that gets standardized and then becomes part of it. But it's all at the pretty superficial level. The core systems just don't change.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Chomsky.
Thank you. Ms. Kuhkan has a question. Ms. Kuhkan, are you with us now?
Yes, I'm here. Let me check if I can turn on the video.
You can, we can hear you well.
Hi, Professor. It is really great to be here and, well, to speak to you in person, actually. Well, I'm not sure if there are any other linguists here, but love and respect from Iranian linguists. I am one of them, actually. I have 4 questions, but I think I have to choose among them. One of them is that it might seem a little bit personal, but have you ever doubted about the basic ideas of the theory, something such as the genetic foundation of language?
Such as what? I'm sorry.
Have you ever doubted the basic ideas of the theory? For example, the genetic foundation of language.
The genitive?
The genetic.
Oh, the genetic foundation of language.
Mm-hmm.
Well, universal grammar is the genetic basis of language. If you ask the question, what genes are involved, that's an almost impossible question. In fact, if you talk to biologists and asked, how do you determine which are the genes that are involved even in simple traits, having blue eyes, it's called fiendishly difficult. The transition from a genome to an organism is a very complex process which is barely understood. Genes actually just code for proteins. Then the proteins do something. They begin to fold in strange ways. They affect something else. After all, you start getting a process of growth. But if you're asking about the genes for language, any effort to find that is in the very remote distance. Genetics just isn't advanced that far. I'm here to talk about genes for language, but that's just a joke.
Mm-hmm. And what future do you see or expect for this approach?
What do I expect for which
What is
project?
going to happen for the generative theory?
For the generative theory? Well, there's a huge amount of work to be done just to try to figure out how the apparently diverse languages of the world actually fit the same mold. We're beginning to think that they do, but to show it is an immense project. There's extremely interesting work that's going to be put, it's in press, will come out pretty soon by Ian Roberts, British linguist, who studied thousands of languages and has a very interesting theory to account for how the process of picking out which points of differentiation among languages are acquired in sequence. It's been a big problem to ask how anybody can ever learn this. There are many differentiations. How does the child work through that set and find a particular one? He has some very striking results on that. An Italian linguist, Longobardi, has also done similar work and come out with complementary results. In the areas of syntax and semantics, an awful lot is just not known at all. There's good reason to believe that they follow the rules of the things we're beginning to understand, but to demonstrate that is a massive project. Also, simply to ask a very simple question. Take coordination. I met a tall, young, angry man in languages where adjectives are post-nominal, most languages. So the equivalent of I met a man, young, tall, angry, eager to go to Europe and so on. You can get a sequence of adjectives, which is unbounded, can be of any length, has no internal structure, just a see, they're like beads on a string. And each one is predicated individually of the same noun. How to handle that is a very complex problem. And none of the rule systems that people know about or have thought about happen to accommodate that. All right, that's another fundamental question. You can go on listing them. There are lots of mysterious things about language. Some of them we'll probably never understand. Like, how is it possible? Let's go back to that formula of Wilhelm von Humboldt that I mentioned. Infinite use of finite means. Part of that we can understand, how a finite object can generate an infinite number of entities. But that's not what he was talking about. He was talking about infinite use. How do you make infinite use? How does finite means allow innovative, creative, novel use? How can you make up a new sentence appropriate to some new situation? Nobody has any idea about that. It's just like, how can you decide to lift your finger? Nobody has any idea. We can look into the mechanisms that make it work, but we have no idea about how you make the decision. These things like this are beyond the range of current science altogether, or maybe of any human science. So there's an endless number of mysteries to explore as soon as you begin to think about what's going on. And if you ask about the future of the field, it'll be trying to plunge into these depths and see how much of it you can make some sense out of.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kulkan and Professor Chomsky. Of course, Ms. Kulkan, there are a lot of linguists in this meeting, and as well as, yeah.
That's great. Hello to all of them.
Most of us are applied linguists, but there are some applied linguists, pure linguists between us, which are all inspired by Professor Chomsky. My gratitude for you, Professor Chomsky, and what you did today for us. Well, we truly appreciate you and your time spent helping us find answers to our question. Thank you very much for this delightful meeting. I'm sure we enjoyed every minute of your lecture, and I'm sure everyone did. I speak for everybody. I think Mr. Khani has a few words to share at the end of this meeting.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mr. Mortazavi. I just wanted to communicate this message to Professor Chomsky and Professor Krashen that this generosity of yours has inspired a lot of people here, and now we feel connected, Professor Chomsky and Professor Krashen. And this is wonderful, because it's very important for everyone in the world to know that they matter. And what you did today actually made us feel that we matter in the profession. And thank you so much for that. Words really fail me to thank you. And I see this action of yours and Professor Krashen as disseminating knowledge beyond borders. Actually, there is no border now. We can have online meetings with you and Professor Krashen and other people in the world. I am so thankful to Professor Chomsky, so much. So I think it's been more than about 90 minutes we've been talking with you, and I know it's a little bit late for you now. So let's see if Professor Krashen has any remarks, any comments before we say goodbye to everyone here. Thank you.
I have waited 50 years to say thank you to Noam Chomsky. That's all I really want to say. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to be with you.
It was a wonderful day. We enjoyed this day. Thank you very much, everybody. Professor Chomsky, if there are any concluding remarks, we would love to hear them. If not, we can. We know that it's late in the United States, so we can call it a day.
Only how much of a pleasure it is to have been able to spend some time with you.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much. So we can call it a day. Have a wonderful day. Have a wonderful night, actually.
Night, yes.
It's more for us, so yes.
And Professor Chomsky, thank your wife for us. I think she was the one who just dealt with the technical problem. So thank her for us. Thank you. And your family.
Okay. And good morning.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Yeah, goodbye, everyone. Thank you for coming.
Goodbye. Goodbye.
Goodbye, Professor Chomsky, Professor Krashen.
Goodbye, Professor Chomsky. Goodbye, Professor Krashen.
Bye, Chomsky.
Bye to all of you. Goodbye. It was a pleasure being here.
Thank you
Yes,
so much,
it was
sir.
a-
Take care.
Thank
you all.
you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.